So what's been so great about this session, which follows on from this morning, is the kind of new ways of working and thinking, and I think that's the thing I'm finding most exciting, is just that whole sense of how to do things differently from all sorts of aspects of our practice, which is fantastic. And now we are on to our last presentation of the day. And it's Terry, who has got the most impressive job title of anyone here, President and CEO and Curator of the Royal Aviation Museum of Western Canada. Thank you.
I have my own timer here too. Good afternoon, everyone. This is my first IATM conference, and I'm excited to be here. Stephen Quick is the individual who inspired me to join this organization, and I've learned so much in the short time I've been here. So thank you for all the presentations that have been given so far. So this is our new museum. It's at the airport in Winnipeg, the International Airport. 4.5 million visitors a day or a year go past our museum, and we hope that not many will resist coming in. You can see a glimpse of its beautiful aerodynamically designed museum, as you would expect for an air museum, as well as it is LEED certified, and all of the energy saving features are within the museum as well. The assignment that was on the page was, tell us what you have done to diversify your audiences and make your programs relevant to new visitors. So that's basically what I'm going to be talking about in the next few minutes. I only put my biography up here because my background is not museums. I started in museums in 2019 when I became president and CEO of this particular museum. But my background has been really helpful. I've been a CFO in industry, chief financial officer. I've also been foreign diplomat with the UN. I've served overseas on this side of the ocean for 9 years. My wife and I, most recent assignment over on your side of the ocean was with the UN in Geneva, and before that, the United Nations in Moscow. So all the things I think have really helped me in terms of transforming our museum. So there's three messages within my presentation. If you just get these two slides, maybe you don't even need any more because I illustrate them. But the first one was around extensive market research helped us to identify our target audiences, which in turn informed our rebranding, marketing strategy, business planning, exhibits development, programming, etc., in order to diversify our audiences and make our programs relevant to new visitors. Our museum started in 1974. In 2018, it shut down to build a new museum for 4 years. So that provides us a bit of a context for these points. And then in terms of community engagement and the creation of our Center of Excellence, it was our belief from the start that relevance to the community would contribute to long-term viability and sustainability, since we are not funded by the government. 95% of our funding is private. We were asked to play a significant role in addressing the labor shortage in the aviation and aerospace sector in our province. Manitoba is a global leader by developing strategies to inspire the next generation. Hence our mission statement, to educate and inspire, and the creation of the RAMWC, which is our Museum Center of Excellence. The other is a commitment to truth and reconciliation and Indigenous inclusion. Why? Because Indigenous peoples were living in the North long before the arrival of the bush plane. So in our old museum for 46 years, the attitude was, it's all about the bush pilots. The other people just happen to be there. Well, no, they didn't just happen to be there. How is it that aviation affected the lives of the people living in northern Canada? And so we've included a lot of that within our new museum and engaged those communities in getting them to tell their perspective. And we become richer people by learning other perspectives. So background, whoops, well, that's fine. So we were incorporated in 1974, as I mentioned. Our mission is to preserve and promote the stories of aviation in Western and Northern Canada while educating and entertaining and inspiring. You can see inside our new museum on the right, and we have lots of school children come through our museum. So our new museum grand opening was on May 19th, 2022. And as I mentioned earlier, we were closed from October 2018 to May 2022. Within our museum, we have 86,000 square feet. I'm not sure what that is in square meters. We have 16 themed story-centric zones. We have 795 square feet of meeting and banquet space, and that's part of our sustainability in terms of financially. We have 12 revenue lines to support our museum. We have bush planes, military aircraft, and we have civil, commercial aircraft as well, and now we're beginning to talk about space as well. We have 2,340 square feet of classroom space, where we have take-flight programs from grades kindergarten to grade 8, and then science, technology, engineering, and math programming, which is new, that we're starting in September for grades 9 to 12. So my mandate when I joined in June of 2019 was to transform and grow the 45-year-old museum. So on the left is our old museum, and it was in an old hangar, TC Airways hangar, and then that is our new facility on the airport campus. So what does transform and grow mean? Well, transform takes many forms. Commitment to truth and reconciliation, Indigenous inclusion, shift from an aircraft-centric museum to a story-centric museum, transforming the volunteer and visitor experience, and adoption of more world-class best practices and standards. One reason why I'm here is to learn more of those of you. And then the other was on aggressive growth. Our ambitious strategic plan calls for a 4-fold increase in revenue with the corresponding growth in attendance. And we just opened in May, but revenue is on track to reach those targets of four times growth. And we have, as I mentioned, we have 12 separate revenue lines as we're not government funded. The building that you saw was a $48 million building. 28 million of that came from private and 20 million came from the government. But in terms of operations, we do not get government funding. And we already have, in the first 2 months, we exceeded the attendance records from the old museum over a 12-month period. So we're well on track. Market research, that was a key part for us. So to grow our audience revenue fourfold, we would have to diversify our audiences and make our programs relevant to new visitors. So basically what we did is we hired a research firm, and we surveyed 1,600 people. 1,200 of them were aviation enthusiasts, and 400 were not. And we wanted to get a sense of, well, what were people looking for in a new museum? And so we were informed about the level of awareness. Only 5% of the province knew who we were. I'd say it's now like 95%. Perspective on museums in Manitoba, visitor expectations and engagement, and we came up with 2 core target segments and 1 opportunity group. And then this helped us to rebrand and provide our marketing strategy, business plan, revenue model, our exhibits interpret plan, and our gift shop development. So on the left are the 2 target markets that we learned about. Flight fanatics, obviously an aviation museum. People that are flight fanatics are going to want to come to your museum. But also engaged traditionalists, which are older Manitobans, often grandparents bringing their grandchildren. And then STEAM moms, it says it's basically science, technology, engineering, arts, and math, who want an education experience for their children. And that's what we've been finding who's been coming to our museum. So that informed our immersive and interactive exhibits. We have a science of flight that isn't shown on this particular diagram, or the mechanics workshop. And then the Ghost of Charon Lake is a great story of one of the first aircraft in our country in 1926 that crashed in 1931. It was the start of the Richardson's dynasty in Manitoba, and they searched for that plane from 1970 to 2005, and it was finally risen. And so that is an exciting part of our museum. So just a little bit on that. So this is just some inside views because we wanted to focus on families. We have a mascot named Hobbs, named after a famous pilot named Basil Hobbs. And so that's a big attraction. And then we have, you can see some space themes to inspire the younger children. Up top, we have the science of flight and creating these family spaces. So what we're finding is that people are buying memberships and they come every Sunday to play in that playground. So that's kind of the intent, right? You want people to keep coming back to your museum. I'm not going to read through these, but I just wanted to point out that what we did from the research, we developed our interpretive plan and visitor experience goals prior to our developing the exhibits. The Center of Excellence has to do with being relevant to the community. So when I first started the job in June of 2019 as the president and CEO, I interviewed 60 to 70 stakeholders, aviation industry, the military, secondary education, elementary school education, and I asked the question, what are your expectations of our museum? Could sum it up in one sentence, and I had shared it earlier, that aviation and aerospace is a critical industry in our province. We have no idea how we're going to sustain our growth. We need new people. And as a museum, with having maybe 100,000 people coming through your museum every year, you have an opportunity to inspire them. So that's our role. And then as we inspire them, that's the easy part, is connecting them to all our partners. This is just, I'm not going to read this either, it's just give you a sense of, because we have a world-class venue, as it turns out, if you look at our museum, every single career is represented in our museum. So as we developed the exhibits, we came up with which jobs would be here, inspired here. And so we use professionals such as aircraft mechanics, navigators, pilots, and so on to speak to the children, to encourage them to consider careers in aviation. And I know you're looking at that Junkers 52. Okay. So we also have a restoration facility. It's 27,000 square feet. And that's at Tomopinor Museum, we restored a Dynavert CL-84, as well as a bush plane called the Belanca Air Cruiser. And so these are just some of our volunteers. But the technical schools and so on want to come and apprentice at a place like this because they get inspired by these people that are well into these careers, know everything about aircraft and so on. So we defined our vision. We are a center of excellence for world-class preservation and storytelling of aviation history and the promotion of aviation and aerospace careers to the youth of Manitoba. So this is a couple examples. So we expect 20,000 students in 2022, 2023. AIM Day is Aviation and Aerospace in Manitoba Day. We had 700 students in for that. And then there's Girls in Aviation Day in September because women and girls are underrepresented in the aviation and aerospace industry as well as STEM education. And so that's a major focus for us, as well as Indigenous peoples are also underrepresented. So those are our two major focuses. And then just as us teaching aircraft propulsion course testing on May 9th with one of the local high schools. So commitment to truth and reconciliation. So in Canada, this is a really big deal. This is it's a very, very hot issue. I think in some ways it has some similarities to what Sam was talking about in terms of the Caribbean community. But truth and reconciliation is a process of healing, relationships, sharing truths, listening to the knowledge that is being shared, and doing our part to redress past harms. It is taking the time to build and maintain mutually respectful relationships. In short, Indigenous children were sent to residential schools where many of them died, were abused, and so it's created a tremendous tragedy for our country, tragedy for those families. And so museums are, in Canada at least, have a commitment to a number of calls to action that are related to truth and reconciliation, such as talking about residential schools, telling the story, not dwelling on it, but telling it. So it's way too much. So these are a couple of examples. So one of the first things I did when I started was I thought, well, I can't think like an Indigenous person. I'm a Caucasian guy, and so what we did is I brought on an Indigenous Curator right from the first day that we started doing the exhibits. And it's been incredibly helpful because every single word that is in our museum has gone by him. He's a professor at the university. And I discovered there are so many trigger words to Indigenous people. You can't say that word because it'll trigger things. And so not only helpful in that way, but also there were numerous times where we wanted to do something out of the goodness of our hearts and well-meaning, but it would be taken the wrong way. So it was helpful to have somebody from another culture help us to navigate what would work and what wouldn't work. So these are just a couple of the calls to action as related to residential schools, as well as policies and practices, especially with our archives. And so far we've forged relationships with three communities, and largely because we've done stuff that they thought was really impressive and very meaningful to them. So I'll share those in a second. So this is an example where Call to Action 62 wants us to talk about residential schools. And so we have an area in our museum that's called the residential school niche. And it's where it talks about residential schools. And so, for example, while aviation brought much good to Indigenous communities, it also contributed to legacies of trauma. Between 1880 and 1996, over 150,000 First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children were torn from their families and placed in residential schools, devastating their languages, identities, and community relationships. Starting in the 1950s, many of these children were transported to the schools by air. So when aviation became a possibility, it all of a sudden became much more children were able to be sent to those schools. So one of the relationships that we developed with the community was not necessarily our intent wasn't to develop the relationship, but I had discovered that 49 years ago, it's now 50, that 8 school children that were coming back from a residential school and the pilot were killed in a plane crash. And there is no memory of them anywhere. And I thought, that's terrible. We have a hockey team where 8 people died, and there's Prime Minister issues a statement every year in honor of that. So what we did is we thought, well, why don't we put together a memorial? So you can see that in the upper right. Then we told the city that we need permission to put it there, and they said, oh, you can't just do that. We're going to build a park, and we're going to put trees, one for each person that died, and they can choose each family that lost a child, and they can choose what kind of tree that they want. The chief, in consulting with him, said, oh, that's fantastic. Can you also build a memorial for us? I'll pay for it and put it on our lands. So that was a tremendous encouragement to us. This is another story kind of about decolonizing our archives. These photos were taken in July of 1922, 100 years ago. And it's a great story because in 1922, this Felixstowe crashed in a lake in northern Ontario. And you can see here, these Indigenous people came to help fix it. And I thought that that's such a great example of partnership that an Indigenous community and bush pilots had right from the very early days of bush flying in Canada. So on the right, they're having a ceremonial peace pipe. They're not just having a shore lunch, but they're actually having a meaningful relationship there. And then what happened just before, we actually produced a 99.9 silver coin commemorating this particular event on July 28th of 2022. But the week before, I was able to discover from that community who the people are, the Indigenous people are that are in the boat, in the canoes. It turns out that the one fellow is the great-grandfather of the current chief, and the other one was the brother-in-law of that individual. So we're now really stepping up our efforts to try and identify the Indigenous people that are in our photo collection, because most often it says Terry, Wanda, and some Indigenous people, as opposed to recognizing them as real people. So also, when you enter our museum, you get the sense of, we want to make a statement that we're committed to truth and reconciliation. So There is the translation in 7 different Indigenous languages, in English and French. And we also have, on the far right there is the chief, major chief that we have in our area. And we also commissioned an Indigenous artist. We had a contest, and they were to paint something that spoke to aviation and truth and reconciliation, and this was the winning photo, and so it's in the lobby in our museum. And then on the final point was we went from being aircraft-centric to story-centric. Well, what does that mean? In the old museum, it just talked about this is such and such an aircraft, built in such and such a year, this much horsepower, et cetera, et cetera. We still have that. But what we did is, what are the stories? So for example, with the Belanca air cruiser, we talk about the deadly cargo. It carried minerals that ended up being used in bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's an important story, sad story, but important one. So it's all about telling the stories. What did those aircrafts do? What did the pilots do? It's obviously very well received. That's it. So thank you for the opportunity to share with you. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, and I'm under time, I think.